Here we go with episode 13 of the Rooks and Becords podcast. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and riding shotgun, as always, is John Young. In this episode, we're going to talk about Swan song albums. That is to say, a record by a band or an artist that serves as their final artistic statement. I have my album, John has his, and I predict some sparks are going to fly, but always in a friendly way. And I'll start on a friendly note by saying, hello, John.
And I'll respond in a friendly way with, hello, Ted. with a slight bit of
like Newman from Seinfeld.
little cayenne pepper in that mix there. And listen,
hello, Jerry.
Right, we joke,
hello,
Jerry.
John.
We joke a lot about having disagreements about records, but believe me, it's more fun to talk about our different perspectives with albums, even if we disagree, because frankly, I learned something when you disagree about an album I just think is awesome, or a artist or group I think is awesome. When you present your side, it does make me go, wait a minute, I never considered that. So I tend to learn something, even if I'm, not crazy about the initial idea that you picked that album. What?
And it's the same, I mean, you got me to rethink when we did the top 5 rock albums. Some of those I was all like, maybe I should go back and listen to that Duran Duran album again. I didn't hear what John was hearing all those years ago. I went back and listened to it with fresh ears, and it came away, I was like, it is a good album, and it's got a lot of great, tasty guitar work, bass work. The songs are pretty solid. They're good pop songs. They're new wavy, of course. There's that synth. But yeah, I learned stuff from you. You learned stuff from me. We learn together.
Yes. Guess who loves Signals by Rush now? Yeah, this guy. Okay. I re-educated myself thanks to you. So there we go.
I thought maybe your brother came around, but maybe not.
No,
I guess maybe after all these years.
He may be hopeless, but I am still somebody who you can appeal to with your deep, deep knowledge of the band Rush.
Okay. But before we get started, John, I'd like to talk directly to our listeners for just a moment. Hello, listeners. It's Ted. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Can I ask you a favor? Please subscribe to our jaunty little podcast. We are on almost every podcasting platform, so wherever you get your podcasts, Rooks and Becords is probably listed there. If you're an Apple Podcast user, consider giving us a review. It helps boost our podcast's visibility in the Apple universe, which is important to grow our vast audience into a vaster one. Thanks. I'm stopping now. So John and I are both actually on the Twitter, so one more little plug. You can follow me at T Asregadoo. That's the letter T, Asregadoo, 2 O's at the end. And John, where can folks find you?
They can find me at capital JCYLCSW. That's John Cole Young, licensed clinical social worker. I just try to make it easier for folks. All caps, JCYLCSW on the Twitter.
Okay, with that, let's shove this thing into high gear and get into our Swan song albums.
Well, Ted, I will kick it off with the Swan song album by an artist that I reacquainted myself with after watching a Netflix biography on Sam Cooke. The death of Sam Cooke, some of the things surrounding Sam Cooke's life that maybe are not well known to the general public, who just remembers him as the purveyor of great hits from the late 50s and early 60s, like Twistin' the Night Away and You Send Me, Another Saturday Night, Chain Gang. He is an amazing artist, and after I played his Swan song record, which is entitled Ain't That Good News, it was released in February of 1964, I realized as I listened to this record how much Sam Cooke's vocal style had influenced the way I try to sing.
Was that a conscious thing? Consciously did it influence you, or was it sort of subconsciously?
I think subconsciously, and because there is no way I would even put my vocal abilities in the same universe as Sam Cooke's, but he does some beautiful work, not only with falsetto and with just straight out beautiful, soulful singing, but he does a lot of what I'd call growling, especially as towards the end of his career in this final record. Rather than just singing a pretty tune, he'll get some of that going and then all of a sudden and it's just, I had forgotten how much I try to replicate that style when I sing live or when I've sang on commercial jingles or whatnot. It made me realize how connected I am to Sam Cooke, the artist. But then I did a little bit more investigation into what Sam Cooke was as an artist and what he was as a social activist. And it couldn't be more relevant right now in the time frame we're living in to talk about social justice and the connection that social justice had to Sam Cooke back in the late 50s and early 60s when the movement was just starting to foment. As you may know, Ted, Sam Cooke was good friends with Muhammad Ali while he was still Cassius Clay before he had
Right.
officially changed his name. He was good friends with Malcolm X. And these forces were pulling on Sam Cooke later in his career to do something besides just churn out the hits for, primarily white audiences that were, dancing on American Bandstand and whatnot. And this final record, this record entitled Ain't That Good News, started to show that not only artistic maturity with the big song off that record, A Change Is Going to Come,
I
but
love that song.
oh, it's just an amazing song. It's been covered
Yeah.
by so many artists. And you were mentioning that you had just seen not a biopic, but a movie.
Called One Night in Miami, which has at least, well, has 4 of the 3 people that you mentioned, all one night in this hotel room. And we were talking before we started recording the podcast, and you said this was based on a stage play, which does, when I watched the movie, I did get that sense that it had a play-like feel where characters have long monologues and things like that, and the action is a little bit more subdued. But what a great film! I didn't know much about Sam Cooke, honestly. I mean, it's not the kind of music that was something that I found inspirational as a teenager, or I'm sure I heard it as a young boy. I only knew the hits. I didn't know this album and the activism that kind of influenced it, from the civil rights movement, from certainly from Malcolm X's influence, and even Cassius Clay, who later became Muhammad Ali. When you picked this record, I went and listened to it. I hadn't heard the whole thing before, and I came away thinking, well, this isn't just twisting the night away.
No.
There's a lot more going
Oh
on
my
here.
gosh, there's good times. There's obviously a change is going to come. There's a whole orchestration that takes over the second half of the record that's not very present in the first couple of songs. And you realize as you look at the writing credits, Sam Cooke wrote half the songs on this record. He wasn't just picking songs written by other artists or having songs written for him, like other artists, Elvis Presley. He was creating and he was directing the band. He was directing his producers. He knew an exact sound he wanted, especially for A Change Is Going to Come. He had a very specific way he wanted the song done, and he directed it. I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but my introduction to Sam Cooke was not because I was out there buying the records as a very young kid. As most people know, or maybe if you don't, you'll know now, Sam Cooke was shot by a hotel manager in Los Angeles back in December of 1964, before you and I were born. So I didn't
Right,
grow up
right.
buying his records either. I heard the songs on the radio. But my first introduction to Sam Cooke in a big way is he is so prominent on the soundtrack to the ridiculous movie Animal House, the 1978 John Landis film with John Belushi and everybody else that was in that movie. I was one of those kids who grew up in the late 70s in an area that didn't have cable. So when we got cable, one of my neighbors and a good friend of mine was able to get Showtime, one of the first cable TV services you could pay for. And they had about 7 movies on a loop that they just played all the time. And one of those was Animal House. I can literally quote every line from it. And Sam Cooke's music is featured so prominently in that movie that when I heard Sam Cooke and listened again to the album Ain't That Good News, it was like, why am I thinking so much about Animal House right now? Because his voice, his music, his band's music was the soundtrack to that particular movie. So if that's how you got acquainted with Sam Cooke, it's time for you to get acquainted with the final record that he recorded before he was unfortunately literally assassinated at the end of 1964. The album is called Ain't That Good News. It is literally a record you can just put on or stream it out your phone where you're driving home sometime. It's less than an hour to listen from start to finish, and it will transport you to a different place. The vocals, the arrangements, the maturity in the writing. It's sad that it had to end there because he was just a
Mhm.
young man. He could have obviously produced so much more material. But if you had to end it some way, ending it on Ain't That Good News is good news.
I would like to just highlight the opening lyric to A Change Is Gonna Come. It starts, "I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like that river, I've been running ever since." This is really evocative stuff. I mean, it's like
Absolutely. And he wrote a lot of the lyrics based on a tour that he was on in the South, surprise, where they tried to get a room at a hotel in Louisiana and were turned away. And this is at the height of his popularity when everybody knows who he is and he's selling out auditoriums. And still, he and his band are turned away at a hotel in Louisiana. And that was the final pushing points for Sam Cooke to start writing about the civil rights movement, about African Americans being kept down by systemic racism. This was the song that opened that up. And you start to wonder, because he had such a large audience and people were listening to him, his death is very suspicious. And it's something that's still being investigated and looked at today.
Really? I did not know that. I
Yep.
didn't know the
Still, the family,
investigation was ongoing.
his family has never been satisfied with the explanation of how he was killed, and it is fishy, and it's FBI and CIA weirdness in the early to mid '60s. I would not be surprised if things didn't go down the way the official record has it.
When I read these lyrics, and I have them up on my screen, so I'm kind of scanning them. But that first part, I was born by the river in a little tent, and oh, just like the river, I've been running ever since. Running from what, right? It's that whole thing like you're trying to get away from something. What he's trying to get away from, at least how I take it, is certainly that oppressive system that kept blacks essentially enslaved, even though slavery had ended. And then he says it's been a long time coming, but I know a change is going to come. Oh, yes, it will. So there's sort of this affirmation, but then there's this sort of biographical stuff that you referenced, like I go to the movie and I go downtown. Somebody keeps telling me, don't hang around. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is going to come. Oh, yes, it will. It has two things sort of pulling at each other, that sort of individual yearning to say, I got to get out of town. I got to get and move on from this and just be my own person and try to figure out not only who I am, but rise and fall based on whatever dream I've got, whether it's to be a iconic soul singer or musician. But then this thing keeps pulling him back. The fact that he is a black man in, 1950s, 1960s America, he comes back to this refrain that I know a change is going to come. Oh, yes, it will. It's not going to come yet, but he knows it will at some point. And when I hear this song, and ever since you told me about the record, and I knew this song, but when I went back and listened to the album, I keep coming back to this song over and over. And I'm just taken by these lyrics, how powerful they are. And that people who don't know Sam Cooke's music, this is definitely the album to get, especially like you said, in the time that we are recording this in 2021, we've just gone through an amazingly polarizing election. We've gone through the killing of a black man that happened in broad daylight, and it was recorded and shared virally on the internet, and people saw it. And it sparked a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was already in existence, but it actually rekindled that. And so I think that, when you listen to something like A Change is Going to Come, you can't divorce it from the reality that we are in today, the present, as it were.
I could not agree more, Ted. And one more thing about those lyrics before we move on is the plaintive lyric where he talks about not being sure what's up in the sky, not knowing for sure. And I think that's really telling also, because as much as I think Sam Cooke wanted to believe things in the speeches of Martin Luther King and even Malcolm X and some of the other civil rights leaders of the time, there was a part of him that felt like, I've been in this game a while and I have a change is going to come. I know it's going to come, but I don't know where it's going to come from. And I think to tie that into what we're going through now, I think people like you and I and other people who are looking out at systemic racism and want to make a change, the change is really us. I mean, I feel like you want to reach back and say to Sam Cooke, you know where it's going to come from, Sam. It's going to come from us. It may not come from some divine intervention. It may have to be, a groundswell of a movement that takes over. And maybe that's what he saw coming up with the civil rights movement. But unfortunately, because of his untimely death, he never lived to see the civil rights acts that were passed in the mid '60s because of his death in 1964.
Since that's such an iconic song off the record, are there other songs that really speak to you off this particular record?
They do. The hit that's on that song, too, that is a great song. It's hard not to like it. Another Saturday Night. And I know you've probably heard that one before. The other song that sticks out to me that I don't think gets the play, although it's considered one of his hits, I don't remember it growing up, is called Good Times. And it has some of that exuberance, but at the same time, it's a cautious exuberance, almost lending itself to that same theme that helped him create A Change is Going to Come. Good times are there, but, and you hear that in the lyrics and you hear that in the way he sings it with that incredible soulful voice that I'd forgotten how powerful it is until you just, quietly listen to that record. Now I was listening in my Mustang, which is not the quietest vehicle to listen to anything in. I was caught off guard about how relaxed I was and how into what he was doing. I kind of tuned it out. I mean, I was focusing on the road to some degree because I'm alive today to tell you about it, but it really transported me. And I recommend our listeners check out Ain't That Good News. The title track is great.
Mhm.
He speaks a lot about love. He's got a song in there called Tennessee Waltz, which is fun. A lot of it speaks to the same things of love and unrequited love and not getting that gal to return my calls. But you can see the maturity and hear it in the writing. And it's a phenomenal record. I've forgotten how much I love it.
Another Saturday Night. The first time I ever heard that song was when Cat Stevens did it.
Aha.
I didn't know that Sam Cooke had done it.
Right.
I didn't know he wrote it. I mean, he wrote this
Yep.
record.
I mean,
The song.
that's the other thing about Sam Cooke, that again, he's not just taking songs from the song factory down the street. You know what I mean? He's
Mhm.
writing and collaborating with musicians, and was able to play multiple instruments so he could get across his musical points to producers and engineers. And just you just start thinking about how tragic it was that he was taken from us so long ago now, and at such a relatively young age.
To reference that movie, One Night in Miami, just for a moment, and granted, it's a drama, so it's not a documentary, so I don't know if the dialogue is in any way accurate, but it certainly makes its point at one juncture in the film where Malcolm X, he's criticizing Sam Cooke, and he says, "You get success, and then you're going to throw the rope over and try to help some people." And Sam Cooke says, "Let me tell you something." And he referenced another songwriter who had a hit, and I can't remember the name of the hit. He had a minor hit with it, and he says, "And then we got a call from some English guys," and they're like, "The Beatles? No, the other English guys." "Which ones?" "The Rolling Stones." "Oh." "And they said, we want to record this song." The guy says, "What do I do?" He says, "Sell it to him. Let him record it. And you watch what's going to happen." 6 weeks later, really, the song goes to number one. The Rolling Stones recorded it. It goes to number one in England. All these people love the song. And then this big fat royalty check shows up, and he keeps getting paid for that. And he said, so his view was at the beginning was, this is my song. I should have a hit with it. And then when he sold it to the Rolling Stones and they had a hit with it and he got paid and he still keeps getting paid, he suddenly changed his tune and said, "Do those English guys want any more songs? Because I've got a whole boatload here."
And Ted, what a prescient point to bring up, because the first live performance that Sam Cooke did of A Change Is Gonna Come, fairly controversial too, because it was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. I want to say it was the 7th of February, 1964. And of course, they wanted him to do, Another Saturday Night or Twisting the Night Away, but he was able to convince the Tonight Show producers to let him do A Change Is Gonna Come. And it was phenomenal. It was terrific. But 2 nights later, on the 9th of February, 1964, those British lads, the Beatles, performed on Ed Sullivan and took all the air out of the room when it came to who's awesome, who's my favorite band, inspiring all these other bands. It's just the timing. Had Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come had a chance to sort of sit around in the public consciousness for a week or two, it may have been a bigger song and a bigger hit, may have made more of an impact.
When I'm looking at the wiki entry on this record, the album itself, Ain't That Good News, and they do say, and this was in the movie as well, One Night in Miami, it said, "A Change Is Gonna Come, with its soaring gospel sound and powerful first-person language, was written in response to Bob Dylan's protest anthem, Blowin' in the Wind, and became one of Popular's music most well-known message songs, as well as Sam Cooke's signature recording." What a way to go out. Unfortunately, too early in life, but if this was going to be his swan song, his final statement, what a statement.
Yep, that's exactly how I felt. That's why this was not a hard exercise for me to go through to find a swan song album that I really think sort of typifies that definition. I know there's several other ones, and you've got a good one too coming up. But thanks for proposing this idea. It really reconnected me to Sam Cooke, to his vocals, to his writing, to what he did as a social justice warrior, and it was a really pleasant rediscovery.
I agree. And I encourage our listeners to go and seek out this record, however you find it. Go buy it, stream it, go on YouTube. I'm sure they have it on there as well. And just listen to it and let it wash over you. And I think that you're going to come away with a message, certainly, that resonates for our times. So, John, sometimes we use terms where the meaning is kind of murky. Take the term swan song. It's supposed to be a final artistic statement, but it's a weird word because according to Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, swans don't sing. They whistle or they trumpet. Then Webster goes on to note, but according to ancient legend, or maybe I should do that with that in a world voice, but according to ancient legend, the swan does sing one beautiful song in its life just before it dies. Exactly. Oh, it's so lovely. Yes. That's exactly what swans sound like.
Thank
And
you.
I hear them outside my window in the morning as
Or on
well.
the golf course.
So it's a strange word. And I thought, well, where did this term come from? The same Merriam-Webster dictionary on the online version, they have these little nuggets of information. They said that the term didn't appear until the 1830s when Thomas Carlyle used it in his novel called Taylor Retailored. Carlyle probably based his, quote, swan song on the German version of the term, and I hope I do this right, Schwandenlied.
Haha. Das ist
Do you
gut,
speak
ja.
German?
Schwandenlied.
Do you speak Schwandenlied?
Nice. That's great, Ted. But you're trying to make that sound for the goose, huh? Or the swan?
Yes. See, do you speak German, John? I
Das
don't
ist
know if you
ein
do or
gut.
not.
I was actually born in Nuremberg, Germany, and I speak
Were
very,
you?
very little. Yes, that's the title of another podcast. Why was
Yeah,
John Young
okay.
born in Germany?
John Young, born in Germany. It sounds like you may have been a military brat, but I'm not sure.
Yep, that's exactly what it was. I wish it was a crazier story. I hid out with gypsies, and that's not how it worked. But yeah, I was a military
I was
brat.
actually a baby at the time hanging out with the Beatles
Yep.
in Hamburg, and that's people don't know this, but I was under their care. Really?
I called George Harrison my dad when I was very young, but that's not true. Let's get back to the Swan song. We've sort of deviated a bit. So let's
Yes, a
get
little
back in,
bit.
you know.
You mean the Schwandenlied?
Schwandenlied.
Yes, okay. So my Swan Song album is Led Zeppelin's 1979 record, In Through the Outdoor, which interestingly enough, their record label is
Swan
Swan
song.
Song. Yes. So if you go and you buy your Led Zeppelin records, every one of them's got Swan Song slapped on the label, which means that every record could have potentially been their last record. I don't know. It's possible.
Wow.
Now, I wrote a long piece on this album for Popdose back in 2014. The series is called Listening Booth, and it was set up so staff writers could use that title to revisit albums or singles. And so in 2014, In Through the Outdoor was 35 years old, and I was writing about the record as it was approaching the anniversary date. This is a record that divides Led Zeppelin fans because it's so un-Zepp. However, I really loved it and I still love it. It's such a departure for a band known for a certain hard rockin' sound. If you put on a Led Zeppelin record, you're going to hear pretty much the same kind of sound throughout the course of their discography. Maybe it'll change a little bit here and there, like with Physical Graffiti or Houses of the Holy. But after Led Zeppelin 2, really, they kind of get that sound down. There is a Led Zeppelin sound. And there's that classic Led Zeppelin sound is what fans were expecting. You cue up the record and you drop the needle or you put it in the CD or you tell Alexa, you say, play In Through the Outdoor, Alexa. And the first track is In the Evening. Now, we can't play these songs on the podcast because Led Zeppelin is notorious for takedown notices, even if it's for educational purposes. They don't care. In the worldwide internets, you can go to any of the places that you can find and listen to the first track, In the Evening.
In
and what you're going to hear.
evening.
Exactly. It's a head fake song. Head fake is a sports term, meaning that, you're telling your opponent that you're going to go one way and you go the other, right? So if you bought this record in 1979 and you put it on, you hear that droning opening, that sounds pretty trippy, and you're thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be great. Stoner music's back. Until Plant starts wailing, in the evening, like you did. I can't sing, but followed by Page's power chord riff. That song is pretty classic Zepp. And it's the last you'll hear of it on that record. After that, get ready for a strange pastiche of sounds, folks, because it gets stranger as track after track unfolds. But let me get your sense of what you thought, John, of that first track, In the Evening. And then we can go to Southbound Suarez.
Yeah, we can go track by track with this album if you want. I, like many Zepp fanatics, I was raised on Led Zeppelin 2. That was the album I was first introduced to the band. I was expecting crunch. I'm expecting amazingness. But I also was paying attention to Zeppelin's career, even as a young man. And one thing that was happening to them as they moved through the albums, Houses of the Holy, Physical Graffiti, Graffiti, Presence, which is not maybe one of their greatest records, but was the album before the one you're mentioning here. Jimmy
Right.
Page was considered one of the governors of his instrument. He was one of the top British lead players. So when In Through the Outdoor showed up on the scene and In the Evening hit, I went, well, there's your Jimmy Page. There's that crazy kind of heavy duty riff with a solo that's very in your face. The first thing I noticed though is Plant's vocals, other than In the Evening, were kind of, I couldn't understand them. And so I didn't care because I'm 14 and I'm pounding my head and going, I got to learn this riff. Oh my God, I got to play this guitar part. I was taken aback by the fact that the lyrics were buried in the mix or they were just kind of, you didn't understand them. So I loved the song and I still love it. When I hear it on classic rock radio, that's the one song on this record that redeems the album for me is In the Evening, even though I can't tell you what Plant is singing about. You have to do a kind of a little research work to get the lyrics or to look them up on Google while you're listening to the song. And it's better just to enjoy the guitar.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
because the lyrics are just non-existent. I mean, they're there to support the melody a little bit, but that was a harbinger of things to come because I didn't realize how crazy things were going to get until we really dove into the album deeper.
Right, and the next track is Southbound Suarez. It has that kind of boogie woogie piano thing going on there, and it's got a little shuffly thing and it's sort of Elvis-y almost.
Sure.
And when this album comes out, maybe you're in junior high at that time, or maybe in high school, and you're just like, this is great. And then the next track comes on and you're like, this is what?
Wah, wah, wah. It was the beginning of Where's Jimmy Page? Let's
Yeah.
just I'll ask that question. Even as a 14-year-old, that's how old I was when this record came out. Where's Jimmy Page on this song? And unfortunately, I didn't hear this album the way maybe you did. I didn't run out and buy it. In fact, I don't own a copy of it because I heard the radio hits first. You heard In the Evening that came out. I
Right,
may have been the
right.
first single. I can't remember, but I knew I liked it. Oh, I got to get this album. I never got around to it. By the time I heard Fool in the Rain and All of My Love, I thought, this sure isn't Led Zeppelin 5. This isn't Led Zeppelin 6. This isn't what I want. And I just started to question what's going on here. It's very keyboard heavy. John Bonham, who is known as a power drummer and just a monster on the kit, and I was a drummer too at the time, I thought, this is kind of shuffly and goofy and funny, but it's not rocking me. And that was my take on Southbound Suarez.
Okay. It's not a great track, but it certainly signals that this band is not going to be trotting out the classic sound
Right.
at all. And then we get to the next one, which is Fool in the Rain. Now, to me, this is a standout track. One of my favorite songs by Led Zeppelin. It's based on this piano riff that John Paul Jones lays down, and there's some really interesting and innovative drumming by John Bonham, where he took this shuffle groove that was made famous by a guy named Bernard Purdie, which is called the Purdie Shuffle. And he adds some accents to it to kind of kick it up and make it his own. Because it's not exactly the Purdie Shuffle. It's got some different accents pieces. And if you listen to that song, you'll hear it because it's way up in the mix. He was playing at a level that was different than the timekeeper that he was known for, that John Bonham was known for. John Bonham is a guy who could keep 4/4 time really great. And he could, branch out into different time signatures, but he was known for being that in the pocket drummer. And so for him to do this shuffle groove with this song just showed that he had way more in him than the kind of drumming that he had done for Led Zeppelin up until this point, because I don't think there's any other Zeppelin track that has that kind of quality to it.
I would agree. I also would say that that's one of the reasons I love this song is because of Bonham's drum track on it. It's the standout feature, unless you want to consider the keyboard part that creates the melody, and that was all John Paul Jones. Another interesting part of this song, besides what everybody mentions is the cool sort of Brazilian breakdown in the
Mhm.
middle of it, is the extremely weird effect Jimmy Page puts on his very C- guitar solo that's in this song. It's almost like somebody put 5 or 6 pillows stuffed in the speaker before they recorded it. I've never heard another
You're
sound
right.
like it.
You're right.
Yeah, if you go back and listen to the guitar solo, it's almost like someone is talking like this to you, except they decided to be a lead guitar and have the same kind of
Very, very tinny. That's for
yeah, I mean,
sure.
just
Yeah.
odd. I mean, and because Page produced and mixed this record, that he
Mhm.
was the one sitting at the console deciding, "Yeah, you know what I need to do? I need to make it a bit more tinny. So I'm going to take all the bass off of this and then just ride the thing right up to the meters so that it sounds like I'm plugging my nose like this, And that's where you get a great song with these little, like as soon as Page puts his part in it, it's like, do we really need that?
Yeah.
Why don't you pull
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Southbound Suarez and just back the hell out of this thing?
And then you talk about the sort of the samba feel that's in there, with the kettle drums and even blowing like a
Yeah, there's like a
sports whistle,
or
you
that what
know?
is they call the hululis or what are those things they play in Central America when there's a soccer match going on? It's really creative and different. It's actually one of my favorite Zeppelin tracks because it's so odd and because of Bonham's drum track, which is just one of
Mhm.
the coolest that he's ever done. So I'm with you there. It is a great song. It's not what you would expect necessarily of Zepp, but I like the way it's mixed. It's one of the few songs on there that has a pretty good mix to it, other than Page's bizarre, whiny guitar solo.
And if you go on YouTube, you can find John Bonham's isolated drum tracks if you want to hear all the little accents and things like that. And you even hear him counting it out. But in John Bonham style, he drops a huge F-bomb right at the beginning. So
Which we won't do here on this podcast, but you can imagine what it sounds like, right?
it was sort of like effing hell.
Especially, especially a giant, fat, drunken English drummer saying it. I mean, just imagine that. That's where you got to put your mind right now.
Speaking of things that just didn't go well on this record, and granted, I like the record. I don't love every song, and here's one of them: "Hot Dog."
Oh, oh,
It's a
oh,
strange song. I mean,
oh,
it's weird.
yes.
It's for Led Zeppelin. It has sort of this rootsy picking country vibe, you know.
Well, and just let me just say right there, you sang that better than Page plays it on the record. I get it that you guys are all gazillionaires at this point and you can do whatever you want, but my cat could play that guitar solo better, and yet you let that thing get out on the album and get out there to the public because you can. Well, da. Oh,
The one thing I will look at in this record, or at least this song, excuse me, on Hot Dog, is that it does kind of signal where Robert Plant eventually heads with his musical interests. And he did a couple of records with Alison Krauss, which were pretty good. And it was kind of rootsy, nothing like Hot Dog, but he wanted to go, I'm certainly wanted to explore that genre a little bit more in depth. He's one of the more musically adventurous members of Led Zeppelin. In fact, he's probably the most musically adventurous member of Led Zeppelin. So
that is a good point. And he did explore Americana and roots music. And you're right. Hot Dog could be looked at maybe as sort of the genesis of that, the beginning of that. But I'm just going to say it, that it's a real turd of a track that I don't think it's not worthy of Zeppelin. It sounds like something they were all doing drunk, you know, where nobody, you recorded this and put it on a record. Really?
Yeah. We needed more tracks for the album,
We
baby.
need one
Really,
more
that's what
track. Do you mind somebody just go in and just do some noodling, you know, and we'll just record it and put it on there, you know, come on.
do something country.
Yeah.
Come on.
now,
Hey,
now I sound like
G, come
their
on.
manager, Peter Grant, who would have
Yeah.
said something like that back in the 70s too. So,
Okay, now you flip over the record if it's an actual vinyl record, and then you get the longest song that Led Zeppelin ever recorded. It's called Carouselembra or Carouselembra, however you want to pronounce it.
Candle Celebra.
Carouselembra.
Wow.
It's supposed to be like carousel music, like, you know, like when you're riding little horses around in a circle at Great America or something. But it's built on this nasally synth sound that John Paul Jones bangs out on his new toys, he said at the time. A Yamaha GX1. That's what it sounds like, man.
It's $1 million keyboard, man. Come on.
But he's able to get some cool sounds out of it. I mean, he mimics bagpipes at one point, and then there's this kind of this new wavy disco part in the last section, because this song is built on 3 sections. The first part is that nasally synth sound with the sort of bagpipey thing where you can't understand the lyrics because it's all pushed back into the mix. So unless you actually had the lyric sheet, which I'm not sure they actually printed the lyric sheet in the original release, they may have, but I have the 2015 re-release that Jimmy Page remastered, and it's supposed to be exactly like it was when it was released in 79, except it's in CD form, but there's no lyrics on there. So you have to go on the Googles and find the actual lyrics and follow along. Okay, back to the song. And then there's a middle part. This is where Jimmy Page kind of comes to the front and he actually is playing guitar, and it's sort of this, I don't know, this rest bit. And then finally it morphs into this new wave disco song. It sounds almost like M's pop music, you know, this weird thing for Led Zeppelin. But what can I say? It struck a chord with me. I liked it.
I know.
I was like listening to it back in 1979. I thought, this is kind of cool. I like this. They're like new wavy now.
Well,
This is
as
great.
you pointed out in your Popdose article, which I read and actually is a great distillation, it distills this record very well. But you point out that when this album came out at really at the height of disco, of
Mhm.
Studio 54, of that culture, that Saturday Night Fever soundtrack was, top of the charts when this record was released.
Okay, so like last podcast, I dissed Kiss's Dynasty because of I Was Made for Loving You, which is a disco song, right?
Right.
But you had the Rolling Stones doing disco. You had Rod Stewart with one of his biggest hits, Do You Think I'm Sexy? A disco song. You even had Paul McCartney doing a kind of a disco-y song. It was all around. And I think part of it was understanding that disco music was certainly popular and maybe they just wanted to try it and see what would happen if they folded in some elements. And then it's also where they recorded this album. They recorded it at ABBA's studio in Sweden at Polar Studios,
Right.
which apparently was one of the best studios out there. And the weird thing is, apparently Led Zeppelin and ABBA were kind of friends. They don't exist in silos and they're going to be influenced by stuff.
Right.
And so maybe at the time that had some kind of an impact on them. And so John Paul Jones and Robert Plant were the first to arrive to the studio, and they started working on stuff. And the other guys, when they stumbled in after their benders or drug use or whatever was going on, they would say, "What are we working on? This. All right, it sounds good. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3, 4."
That was going to be the point I was going to make. Got to remember, we have to keep coming back to this because this is my problem with this record in general. Jimmy Page's, listen, I never want to blame someone for their drug addiction necessarily. He was in the throes of the worst part of it when this album was being recorded and marketed, and then the tour behind it. Eventually, John Bonham lost his life, a year or so later due to alcoholism. Jimmy Page was a session guy during the making of this record. And so whatever weird stuff was happening, some good, some in my opinion, not so good, was really being driven by Robert Plant and John Paul Jones. Like you said, they're showing up at the studio first. They're the ones going, "Hey, I've got this new Yamaha GX. What if I do this? Beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop. I like it. I like it too.
I like
Let's
it.
put it on."
That's lovely.
Right. Then you have
Let's-
Page, stumbling in 5 hours or 5 days later and going, "So, all right, here's on. Let's just go. Let's play up. I'm so tired, And
Yeah.
and I think that had an effect on the way that you hear this record, at least the way I hear it.
It is definitely a band falling apart, even though there are moments where each individual member does shine in their own way.
Yes.
All of My Love. This is a song that was dedicated to Plant's son. His name was Carrick, who died from a viral infection when Led Zeppelin was on tour in 1977.
Horrible story.
Apparently, the boy had gastroenteritis,
Yeah, just
which
awful.
it was a pretty, well, very deadly. Let's put it that way. If you get this viral infection, it's deadly. In fact, my brother Steve, who was on this podcast earlier, when he was a baby, he had gastroenteritis and almost died as well. If you can't treat it quickly, it's pretty much over. So Plant writes the song, and it's a song that Jimmy Page couldn't stand. Hated it because it was a ballad. When I was researching the Popdose piece that I wrote, I looked on this book called Robert Plant, A Life, and this guy named Ross Halfin said, Page's reaction to not only All of My Love, but the entire album was harsh. Quote, "Jimmy is embarrassed by In Through the Outdoor. He hated All of My Love, but because it was about Carrick, he couldn't criticize it. The other thing that Page couldn't criticize was the fact that the album helped revitalize the depressed music market at the time when U.S. record sales were at a low or were slow. In Through the Outdoor shifted 4 million copies in just 3 months, single-handedly bringing the market back to life, according to Paul Rees, who wrote in his biography, Robert Plant, A Life." So it's a polarizing record, but boy, it made them a lot of money and it helped the record industry too.
It absolutely did. I remember reading in Hammer of the Gods, which is one of those early Led Zeppelin biographies, about how Led Zeppelin's In Through the Outdoor saved the record industry. That's a common refrain when you read about what was happening in the record and music industry in 1979. And I just want to say about All of My Love, because I don't want to attack this song either because of the sentiments behind it. What I will say from a production standpoint, this is the musician and pseudo-engineer in me, is this is a song, I'm so glad it meant so much to Robert Plant, but I have a hard time hearing it even today because Robert Plant's vocals, which although he's considered an amazing singer in a lot of ways and a pioneering singer in a lot of ways, he was not a classically trained singer. So you can hear him squeak live. If you really want to torture yourself, go back and watch their Live Aid performance. I mean,
Oh God.
it's
Yeah.
horrible. And so
Yeah.
Plant has a propensity not to sing perfectly. Like he had some studio help with a lot of their records so that either they would speed his vocal up or they would do something to mask some of the inadequacies, I'll say.
Mhm.
He doesn't do any of that in All of My Love. He literally just grabs a microphone with no effect on it and sings, which is fine, except that there are points where he is just on the outside of being out of tune, or, and he's just sort of doing these things with no, I mean, in the studio, even in 1979, they could have put some reverb on it. They could have done something to balance out. And maybe what he was going for was just a raw emotional approach to the song,
Mhm.
which I support. It's a tragedy that happened to he and his family. But that song as a vocalist for me is hard to listen to because the vocals just aren't very good. It sounds like he did a demo that he should have gone back in and cleaned it up or harmonized with himself or done something. Those vocal parts are they're just isolated with nothing on them, just kind of sitting there. And because they're not sung very high, the emotional resonance doesn't capture it for me. That's just my take on
Mm.
it. I know Zepp fans are going
Interesting.
to hate
Okay.
my guts for that, but that's just
No, no,
how I
no.
felt about that song
Yeah.
forever.
You bring a musician's ear to it and somebody who's also worked on your own records and been in the studio and know what goes into producing an album. So you can hear some of the things that they didn't do that they probably should have done in the recording studio just to make sure that you had that buffer so he's not singing out of tune, that he's
Sure.
not,
I mean,
you know.
God, you want to live up to the expectations of Kashmir and A Whole Lot of Love and
Mhm.
I mean, I could go on and on and on. I mean, I wouldn't suppose at all to say that Robert Plant could learn anything from me vocally. Oh my gosh, he's considered one of the great rock and roll singers, as he should be. It's just this was one of those things in a studio where you're creating something. You typically don't get it the first time, and you listen back and go, I didn't hit some of those notes. I'm gonna go in there. I'm gonna clean this up or do this. And it just sounds like they didn't do it. It sounds again like the solo in Hot Dog. Like, just leave it in. That doesn't matter. Like, yeah, we're Led Zeppelin. Who cares? And
Next track. Come
next
on.
track,
Let's go. Let's
I've
move it.
got a party to get to. It's Studio
Exactly.
54. Come on, man.
And for the last track is I'm Gonna Crawl. And it was a hint of what's to come with the Honey Drippers in 1984. So to me, I hear some of Page's guitar work on there that's reminiscent of what he did on the Honey Drippers and even John Paul Jones's keyboard work. It's an okay song. I mean, well, maybe not. It's not that great of a song now that I think about it. Now that I'm just sort of like replaying it in my mind, I'm like, no. But it does hint at where they're going to take, or at least Robert Plant, where he wanted to go musically after Led Zeppelin. And it's keeping with the album's theme. And to me, it was sort of acknowledging the past, which was like that first track in the evening, and then pointing towards the future, which was perhaps with Carouselembra or All of My Love, or even I'm Gonna Crawl. And they're trying to find a way to express all this, these two forces that are pulling them in different directions. And they're trying to express it in the present. And I think for better, or for worse, and for a lot of people would say for worse, In Through the Outdoor just didn't do it for them. And I know that Led Zeppelin released Coda, and that was sort of a contractual obligation album that they released a few years later. And it had like 3 songs that were from that same session. One was called Ozone Baby, Darlene, and Wearing and Tearing. I think that they were going to save those songs for the next album, but of course, there was no next album because John Bonham died, and then they decided to break up the band because they didn't want to do what The Who did, which was to get another drummer who could reasonably keep time and do a good job. And somebody like maybe Phil Collins. I think Phil Collins wanted to join Led Zeppelin at one
I
point.
mean, who didn't want to join Led Zeppelin as a drummer
Right,
because of
right.
the
Yeah.
cachet that would go with that? But they also should get some credit for that as we wrap up the discussion, Ted, is Zeppelin did something that a lot of bands weren't gutsy enough to do, which is call it quits. And I think to some degree they've maintained their mystique and their legendary status because of that. I know there's been a few reunions here and there, and there's been some fits and starts and that Live Aid Sooner Forgotten, but then they had
Boy,
a
it was
great
bad.
get together in December of '07 at the O2 Arena. Where,
That was great. I have that. That's called Celebration Day
oh,
was the album, right?
awesome! I
Yeah.
mean, with
Yeah.
Jason Bonham, John
Mhm.
Bonham's son on the drums. He's an incredible drummer, so they sound amazing. Jimmy Page sounds better than he has in decades. Clearly, the musicianship and the aura around them is still there, but I think they did something gutsy and kind of cool by saying, nope, we're not going to go on with Phil Collins or Cozy Powell or any of the other British drummers or Carmine Appice or somebody who could jump in and play on a tour. They decided against it. It's kind of cool.
think you're right. I think they kept that mystique intact. And while Robert Plant went on to do, and he's still doing some really interesting work. I like his solo career. I
I do
really do.
too.
I
I'm
think
a fan.
he goes in many different directions, whereas Jimmy Page kind of is just stuck in Led Zeppelinville. You know, that like this is his thing. Like he doesn't want to move on from it in any way.
Well, it's because, Ted, once you do something as well as Led Zeppelin, you don't really need to expand your palette, if you will. As long as I've got a Les Paul and a guy or two or 10 to take care of all my guitars and my amplifiers, I don't need much more than that. So I just thought to keep playing and making great music, the same kind of music I've made since 1963. Thank
If
you.
George Lucas can, redo Star Wars 50 million times, why can't I?
Right,
Right?
right.
Yeah,
So
right,
just,
right.
bugger off and just let me get back to my practicing.
All right, Jimmy, enjoy that.
Goodbye, Mr. Page. Thanks for stopping
Really.
by.
As we wrap up, and I thought this was a really interesting conversation because we've had two albums. One was certainly polarizing, and the other one probably was polarizing for the time because it wasn't just twisting the night away, right? It was something that a little bit more with a lot more gravitas. And these were swan songs. These were the last expressions of these artists, whether it was Sam Cooke or whether it was Led Zeppelin. And this is it. So take away from it what you will. And I certainly have become much more aware of and a fan of Sam Cooke's music because of what you spotlighted, John. I don't think that I'm going to convince you on Led Zeppelin's In Through the Outdoor. I don't think it's going to happen.
I would say, though, a little codicil to the Faber College Constitution here is that you have me remembering what I did like about that record, because the record saved the record industry because a gazillion people bought it. I didn't buy it, but did I listen to it every time it came on the radio? Yes. Do I still love to go back and look at YouTube videos of their Nebworth show where they performed a lot of that record in 1979? Yes. That album still has a lot to recommend it. Fool in the Rain is a great song. In the Evening is a great song. Give Led Zeppelin credit. They were in their early 30s at that point. They'd been through a lot, personal tragedies and whatnot, and they were trying to find direction. And had John Bonham not died about a year later, who knows what they might have done. So you've given me a different perspective on In Through the Outdoor as well. I will give you credit, Mr. Asregadoo.
Thank you very much. And as we wrap up, let's reiterate, where can people find you on the socials?
Please check me out on Twitter, JCYLCSW, all in caps if Twitter cares. If they don't use caps and see if you can still find me. I'd like you to find me, JCYLCSW on the Twitter.
For me, it's Asregadoo, the letter T, ASREGADOO. John and I will be back next time for more chitty chatty about music and the world of albums. Thank you so much for tuning in. John, thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon as we're recording this. And it's always fun to go down memory lane with you and learn stuff.
Listen, Ted, I appreciate, as usual, as we twist the afternoon away. Thank you so much. Love you, buddy. Can't wait to talk again.
Talk to you soon.